Whenever people talk about the Zelda timeline, someone inevitably mentions that for the early games, they were just games, and that they weren't intended to link up in any meaningful way. I never really questioned that claim and just assumed it was true until the other day when I heard someone say this just as I was in the middle of writing the script for my analysis of Zelda 2's impact on the series. And having just finished replaying the first 3 games, suddenly it dawned on me that this claim that gets thrown around so much just isn't even remotely true. In fact, I would say that aside from the 4 Swords games, every game in the Zelda timeline was intended to be placed in that position relative to the other games in the timeline at the time of its release. To prove this, let's go through the games in the series and consider what the intention was for how they fit into the timeline at the time of release, and whether it seems like Nintendo had planned that as they were making the game, or if they came up with it later. Since The Legend of Zelda is the first game in the series, at release, it was the timeline. The basic story, which appears in both the manual and on the title screen, is that Ganon has taken the Triforce of Power and captured Zelda, who scattered the pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom throughout Hyrule. She sends Impa to find help, and luckily she runs into Link. The game then consists of Link finding the pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom, killing Ganon, and rescuing Princess Zelda. With this in mind, let's move on to Zelda 2. Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link is a direct sequel to the first game, taking place a few years later, around Link's 16th birthday. Ganon's army continues to threaten Hyrule, even with him gone, since they seek to capture Link and use his blood to revive Ganon. Here, we find out that at some point long before the events of the first game, there was another piece of the Triforce of Courage, which was hidden away for a worthy hero to find it. And also, a Princess Zelda from the distant past was cursed into an eternal slumber by a magician seeking the Triforce of Courage, and you need the power of the full Triforce to awaken the sleeping Princess Zelda. As a direct sequel, where it fits within the timeline is very clear and obviously intended, with the manual literally saying, "At the end of a fierce fight, Link overthrew Ganon, took back the Triforce, and rescued Princess Zelda. However, is it all really finished? Many seasons have passed since then." The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past is the first game not to be a direct sequel to the previous game. Rather than continue with the same Link from the past games, this introduces a new Link who lives with his uncle prior to the start of the game, this time not in the desolate remains of the Kingdom of Hyrule like in Zelda 1, or the small, diminished version of Hyrule seen in Zelda 2, but in a functioning Hyrule kingdom with a castle, an army, and citizens that feel like unique characters rather than filler NPCs. In this game, Ganon takes the form of the wizard Aghanim, who tricks the king into trusting him and uses this position to attempt to take over the Light World, having already taken over the Sacred Realm long before the events of the game. The manual for this game is full of lore, but of importance to us is that it says that 3 goddesses created the Triforce and left it in the Golden Land, aka the Sacred Realm, where it stayed untouched until a thief named Ganondorf entered the Golden Land and claimed the Triforce. This transformed him into the beast Ganon, and turned the Golden Land into the Dark World. This led to the Imprisoning War, in which the 7 wise men, aka sages, sealed Ganon in the Dark World to prevent him from taking over the Light World. One quick tangent here. Some people may have heard that the English language manual says that the thief's name was Ganondorf Dragmire, and that he was also known as Mandrag Ganon. If these names sound like they don't fit within the Zelda series, that's probably because the translators completely made them up. The original Japanese version just says that his name was Ganondorf and he's commonly known as Demon Thief Ganon. Regardless of all this juicy lore, it gives us the clues we need to figure out its timeline placement. It tells us very clearly that Ganon was the first one to claim the Triforce in the Golden Land after its creation by the goddesses, and that Ganon did not leave the Golden Land, or rather the Dark World he had turned it into, until just before the beginning of the game, when he came to the Light World in the form of the wizard Aghanim. Since we know that the Triforce was in the possession of the royal family prior to the events of the first 2 games, they cannot have taken place prior to A Link to the Past. This indicates that the game was intended to be a prequel to the previous entries, taking place long before them as a sort of origin story for the series, fitting for a game whose English title contains the word past. One question this leaves open is how Ganon ends up alive again by the time of Zelda 1. I don't know what the answer is, but I have come up with my own headcanon theory for it. Remember how in Zelda 2's manual, it says that Ganon's followers want to use the blood of Link, the one who defeated Ganon, to revive him? So my headcanon is that at some point after the last adventure we see the hero from A Link to the Past go on, they capture him, or possibly wait until he dies and dig up his grave, and then they use his blood to resurrect Ganon, a truly awful end for the hero, but also a valid explanation for how Ganon returns without introducing any new mechanics to the series. But again, that's completely made up headcanon with no basis in evidence. Link's Awakening is pretty open and shut, since it takes place after the hero from A Link to the Past completes his quest and he sets sail to seek a new adventure. It's clearly nowhere near the events of Zelda 1, so at the time, its timeline placement would have been unambiguous. However, there is now room for debate on its position thanks to complications introduced by Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. This is largely due to conflicts in what some players see as obvious, and some small details that may have even been oversights by the creators at Capcom. But in the grand scheme of things, it is clear that they must take place either right before or right after Link's Awakening, so their general location in the timeline was still intended. I'll count that as a win, especially since they were developed by Capcom rather than Nintendo. Now, Ocarina of Time does present some complications, since it features the story of the three goddesses from the Manual of A Link to the Past, and it tells the story of Ganondorf, who was already named as the man who became Ganon upon seizing the Triforce, but the stories differ significantly. So was this meant to be a reboot, or was it another time they said, scratch that, this is the origin story for the series? The differences, of course, could be hand-waved away under the excuse that the story in the manual was just how the story was remembered by the time of A Link to the Past. But it would be nice to have some evidence that this was the intention. Luckily, we have just that, because Satoru Takizawa, who worked on character design for Ocarina of Time, said the following in an interview while explaining the design of Ganondorf. "The story this time is not a true original, as it covers the Sealing War of the Seven Sages that appeared in the previous Super Famicom title." That seems pretty clear to me that it was intended to fit in the same timeline if it was intended to be a prequel as early as when they were designing Ganondorf. But to push the question a little further, did they intend for the timeline split? As for the adult and child timelines, the answer is a resounding yes, since both timelines are featured in the credits of Ocarina of Time, showing that even back when Ocarina of Time was first released, they were canonically meant to continue existing past the end of the game. But what about the Downfall timeline? Well, if we know the game was intended to be a prequel to the earlier games, it doesn't make much sense for them to end the game with two timelines, neither of which leads to the previous games. So there is some logic in reasoning that they must have already decided that there was a third split in which Ganon successfully claimed the full Triforce in the Sacred Realm and managed to hold on to it until the events of A Link to the Past. Of course, it is a bit weird that they would intend for essentially the main ending, the one that leads to all the other existing games in the franchise, to be the one that just sort of, what if Link failed, rather than one of the two endings that comes as a direct result of the time travel. But there are already plenty of theories for explanations of how this timeline could come about naturally, such as the one presented in Bandit Games' video, The Abandoned Timeline, or my preferred theory, which is that every time you use the Temple of Time, it does split the timeline, and the Downfall timeline is what happens in every adult timeline that you abandon by going back to the child timeline. And we did recently get one piece of evidence that, while not 100% solid, does provide some indication that the Downfall timeline was decided upon long before 2011's Hyrule Historia when we all found out about the timeline. This evidence is Retro Studios' cancelled Zelda project worked on between 2005 and 2008, which one of the artists on the project described as taking place, quote, within the bad ending of Ocarina of Time. Now, we do need to keep in mind that he may have some of the details wrong, or there may have been multiple conflicting ideas that were never fully filtered down into one coherent story before the project was cancelled, as he uses some incorrect terminology, such as referring to, quote, the last male Sheik, presumably meaning to say, the last male Sheikah, plus some of the plot points just don't make sense, since he also describes it as a, quote, origin story of the Master Sword, which obviously couldn't possibly occur after Ocarina of Time unless they intended something to happen to the Master Sword for it to need to be recreated. Regardless, we know that Ocarina of Time was intended to be a prequel to the games we now know to be part of the Downfall timeline, and somehow they intended it to eventually lead to a world in which Ganon entered the Sacred Realm and was sealed there along with the full Triforce to set up the events of A Link to the Past. And from here on out, we don't really need much of an explanation, since the relationships between games are much more clear, but I'll run through it anyway for completeness. Majora's Mask is a direct sequel to Ocarina of Time, taking place obviously in the child timeline since Link is still a child. Wind Waker's backstory clearly sets it up to take place in a post-Ocarina of Time world in which the hero disappeared and never returned, which is exactly what the adult timeline is. Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks feature characters from Wind Waker, but older, which makes their placement clearly intended. Minish Cap was clearly intended to be a prequel to the whole series, again, and the Four Swords games I actually don't think any thought was put into in terms of timeline placement, hence the confusion they cause, but those also were really designed as spin-off multiplayer games anyway, so there really wouldn't be any reason to consider them for the timeline if Minish Cap hadn't been set up as a prequel to those games. Twilight Princess follows the events of Ganondorf's botched execution after the events of the Child timeline, which also makes its timeline placement pretty obviously intentional. They were very clear about Skyward Sword being the origin story for the series, again, and A Link Between Worlds is clearly set in the same Hyrule as A Link to the Past, sometime after the lifetime of the previous hero, and sometime before Ganon returns and kicks off the events of the first two games. Triforce Heroes, while also a multiplayer spin-off game that probably shouldn't count anyway, takes place after A Link Between Worlds featuring the same hero, so its timeline placement is easy enough anyway. With that, we've reached Breath of the Wild. Nintendo has stated that it takes place at the end of all timelines. Whether that was their real intention or a placeholder answer before they reveal the real answer in Tears of the Kingdom remains to be seen, but what we do know is that if they really don't have an intended placement for Breath of the Wild, it would be the first time Nintendo has ever released a Zelda game without deciding on its timeline placement ahead of time. Hopefully this video can put this misconception to rest once and for all, but I did keep it pretty surface level, so if you think there's something I missed, let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I've been Loyal Sage, and I'll catch you guys later.